something of the variation of what's the point? What's the point of reading? Especially when it's not a self-help book. It's not a book that's going to give you a degree or help you qualify for something. And I kind of pondered on this question as well. I'm like, Waldi, you're full of good questions. People just assume, oh yeah, it's good to read. But why? Why should you read? Why can't you listen to a podcast? Hey, welcome back to my channel. And if you're new here, I'm Paul Minta and I make videos on creativity, faith, meaningful productivity, things of that sort. And today I want to start by talking about a question that I was asked on social media. Maybe some of you know this, maybe not. I think it's more like of a regional thing. I put out the introduction videos from Skillshare on my other channels, on YouTube, on Telegram. I share tips on drawing, on expressing your ideas through creative means like drawing quickly, communicating visually, things of that sort. And I've also appeared on several TV interviews, podcasts. And so I have a few people, especially young people, come up to me once in a while and asking me questions about the things that I talk about, whether it's the learning experience, how to be a lifelong learner, or how to be a creative, how to be a creative in the professional field, things of that sort. So this is one of the questions that really stuck with me. It was by Walde, and it took me a while to even know his name because he started by talking about my work and then asking about what books I would recommend he would read. And whenever people ask me that question, first of all, I feel a little embarrassed because I'm not as avid a reader as I used to be, and also that I don't know what to recommend because I've read several books and I haven't really loved a whole lot of them, or at least in retrospect, I would look at them and be like, okay, but why did I read that? And sometimes it was really to prove a point that I read the classics, or I read like just to get a friend off my back because they were such a huge fan of the book, and they were like, you must read it, and then I read it and I'm like, okay, I guess I read it. Well, now I can tell them I read it and they will leave me alone. It's like watching TV shows or series, things like that. So sometimes I read books for that reason. Sometimes it's a more organic or a stranger encounter with a book or with an author. So I recommended that he read Maya Angelou's Letters to My Daughter, and it was a book that my dad bought for me back in when we lived in Saudi Arabia, and I was around 14 years old, yeah, and I already had read her short poems on our English literature book, and she's taught in schools, so at least American systems. So I saw that and I just became a huge fan of her. My sisters and I turned one of her poems into a song, and it was something about not being frightened and being fearless. It was really inspiring, at least for young kids to read. And when I saw her book in Jarir bookstore, it's a bookstore in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia where I lived, it was a very, like, just reading the first few pages was like listening to a friend talk to you about something, about some rough things they went through, and they're like, yeah, this happened. And you just read story after story, and I just could not get enough. And it was this beautiful flower hardcover book, and I couldn't, like, even when my dad bought me the book a month or so, maybe a couple of weeks later, it wasn't the same cover, it was a soft copy, and I still cannot find the hardcover version that it's like it's almost just in my dream, or like something that I made up. The hardcover, it was one of the prettiest covers. So you focus on these things a lot as a kid, I feel. So I recommended him that book, and he was like, yeah, I read it. And I was like, why do you say you don't read? Because he was like, I want to start reading, but I don't know where. And I'm like, homie, you already, okay. Because I feel like people don't say I'm a reader when they feel like they don't qualify or they haven't read the quota of books that makes you a reader or whatever. So I was just like, okay. And he was like, yeah, but I stopped around like chapter 11. And then I was like, okay, all right. And then he was like, okay, so how do you remember the key points of a book? Like, I have this problem where I read a book, but once I finish that book, it's like I forget everything that happened, and I don't know how to remember the main points, the main vocabulary in that book. And again, that was a very good question, because for a lot of people who don't speak English as a first language, it's reading books is not a matter of having an experience or finding out about an author, a person who lives on the opposite corner of the earth, and experiences that you probably never would feel because you don't have the same personality, the same experiences as this, or the same context, setting, upbringing of this other person that you're reading about. So a lot of times it's like, it's not just a matter of that experience, reading a book, whether it's fiction, non-fiction, whatever. It's a matter of improving your English language skills, especially as a second English as a second language speaker. And I remember back when we were in school, middle school, I remember there were kids who read the Harry Potter series, and it was a widespread thing among us that people who read the Harry Potter books were better at English in general than people who read, let's say, the Twilight series. And this was just by virtue of how good the vocabulary or how diverse the vocabulary is in the book, how well it's written in the Harry Potter books versus the Twilight books. And this was a very key difference for us. And some of the girls were from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, India, Egypt. So it's like they spoke different languages at home. But when we got together in school, we spoke in English. And because that's the language that brought us all together. And it was an international school. And so the diet that we grew up on, the language diet that we grew up on, determined how well we performed in our English language classes, in our essay writing. So the kind of books we read growing up really affected that result. And so people were more conscious of what they read, or they were more conscious of the differences between them and their peers based on the things that they read growing up and how much they read. And for the Harry Potter series, it's clearly a very big series. So just by virtue of reading a lot, it's a very big step for someone who doesn't take English in their regular language diet, who doesn't speak it in their house, and so on. So there's that extra added layer, that extra element for people who don't speak English at home. So there was that. So I remember that, at least, when this person was telling me about it, and when he told me why do you read, how do I remember the vocabulary in a book? And I started thinking about how many times I don't really think about that, and it's something that used to be a very important part of why I read a book. And today it's like I try to pick up on the voice, and I try to remember how I did have some words from those books stick with me. So I think the few that I wanted to share are the fact that when you read a book and you see, sometimes you will see that an author likes using a word, a certain word or a certain set of words, and you find it interesting. I think it's very important to have intention with this. Don't try to pick up vocabulary for the sake of bragging or for the sake of showing off. For me, picking up more vocabulary or a more diverse range of vocabulary, at least especially if you're a second language speaker and you don't know how to express yourself properly in the second language, the point of that is expression. Like I was just saying, the point of that is to communicate in a more evocative, more in a way that encapsulates what you're trying to say, what you're really feeling inside, and trying to relay that to someone else, whether it's an idea or knowledge, new discovery, feeling, whatever it is. You're trying to make your description as colorful, as full as possible, so that this person doesn't have to make assumptions or fill in the holes that you left in your description with other thoughts of their own. No, you're trying to paint a full picture with your words, and the larger the set of words or the more effective they are, the more colorful the picture you're trying to paint is going to be, at least for me, I think. So when he said that, so how do I remember the vocabulary, I think the main thing I wanted to share, or I wanted to say, and I think I might have said it, is like try to use the words as you see them. So, for example, if you go to school and you're still writing essays in English, or let's say you're writing for yourself, like you're writing journal entries. And by the way, it's really good to start journaling. I feel like reading and journaling kind of can go hand in hand in improving your language communication skills in whatever language you're trying to improve. So if you're journaling, for example, when a situation comes up where a new word that you saw in a book can be used, try to use that word. Try to see how that sounds. Try to make it feel like a more natural part of your vocabulary. If it doesn't feel natural when you're writing down this new word, when you're using it to describe something that happened to you or something that you observed, then don't use it. The point of using more larger range of words for me is to paint a fuller or a clearer picture. But if you can paint that picture with simpler words or words that you already know, leave behind the fancy, flowery language. You don't need that. I really think you don't need that. And I think it shows when you're trying to just use flowery language for the sake of it, just to be like, oh yeah, I know how to use this word, and I know my vocabulary is this advanced or whatever. I don't think that's the point of good writing, or I wouldn't qualify that as good writing. My favorite authors didn't do that. My favorite authors usually try to connect with the human experience, connect with a fellow stranger in as economic a way as possible. Use as little words as possible to describe the same feelings. Use flowery language only when it's necessary. So I think it's really important that I do that, at least for myself, I thought. And then another thing is, I felt like what he was asking me is something of the variation of what's the point? What's the point of reading? Especially when it's not a self-help book. It's not a book that's going to give you a degree or help you qualify for something. What's the point of reading? And I kind of pondered on this question as well. I'm like, Wildy, you're full of good questions. Very, very basic questions that we should ask. Like, people just assume, oh yeah, it's good to read. But why? Why should you read? Why can't you listen to a podcast? Why can't, you learn a lot from listening to some podcasts, to listening to some people from various professions. Why can't you just do that? I know people who do that and who prefer that over reading, over sitting down and taking time to read. And honestly, these days, I love listening to podcasts as well. I love listening to astrophysicists, to entrepreneurs, people, CEOs of companies that I don't want to be a part of or be involved in, but I want to listen to their experiences. I want to listen to how they deal with leadership, how they grapple the big questions of our universe, and how they carry out research and feel humbled by the things that they were proven wrong about, feel in awe, or feel this childlike wonder of the things that they're yet to discover, and things that they just expanse of knowledge that we're yet to navigate. So I love listening to that, and it's really well conveyed in podcast form, I believe. But for me, reading a book is, first of all, feels a lot more intimate. It feels like sitting down with someone's thoughts at your own pace. It feels like it's not just something that you're listening to someone talk, and we listen to people talk almost every day. Probably if you go to your work, to school, you listen to people's ideas. You listen sometimes to thoughts that you want to write down because it came from a very profound place. It came from a lesson that was learned the hard way, and you want to write it down. You want to keep note of it. It's really cool to have that speaking experience. But then also I feel like reading has a different dimension to it. Reading someone's thoughts, what has been distilled from someone's soul, their voice, feels like you're making this weird, it's almost like having this connection with someone that you're probably never gonna meet in your life. This person has probably passed away. You're listening to this with your own voice, churning it through your own experiences, like when you're reading. But it's a set of experiences that you probably will never experience. And for me, it's like traveling. It's like soul travel. I call it soul travel in a way. I feel like reading Milan Kundera's Unbearable Lightness of Being taught me something about the Czech Republic, about Prague in the time that was written, that is probably doesn't exist anymore. That time and that place does not exist the way it is. The city in the Czech Republic exists, and that's probably the only thing I'm gonna know about the Czech Republic, and it's probably not even something that's very resonates with current people from that country. But reading about that author's experiences, even though the characters were fictional, even though many of the experiences were fictional, the descriptions, the things that he talked about, how he conveyed the different complicated things about humans was just so profound for me and so cool to read about. And it felt like traveling in a way, yeah, and traveling in a much more deeper way than actually just going there and being a tourist and just gawking around, not speaking the language. I think Chimamanda said something like this about the idea that you can be much truer in fiction because you can't afford to be that honest in nonfiction, in memoirs, or in any work that's true or based on true events. Many people can't. It's really hard to because there are all these other people that you're writing about are also alive. So like I can understand authors trying to compromise, trying not to go too deep, trying not to speculate on what other people were feeling about their intentions, because you can't really do that properly. So, but with fiction, it's like she had done that really well in her book, Americana. She talked about all sorts of people's experiences, their suspicions, probably things that she has heard in real life, but she merged with different people, like she probably merged different characteristics of different people in her life together. It reveals something about human character, personality that I think you couldn't or would not see in nonfiction or see in real life. Like you don't see people talk about some of the things that are described in very deeply in fiction. So for me, what is the point of reading a book is that it's connecting with a person or a human voice that's very different from yours in a way that is very humble, and in a way where you're just a listener here, you know? In a real life conversation, you kind of have to participate in the talking, you have to keep it going, you have to reciprocate this energy. But here, this person poured their soul into a text, and it was edited and all of that work was done, yes, but this was this person's thing that they put out into the world, and now you're consuming it alone at your pace and listening, just listening and listening and listening to this person. And I really feel like reading does make you a better listener, at least for me. I think it makes you pay attention and read between the lines, pun intended, I guess. I've learned a lot more from reading fiction books where there's no point, you know, there are no atomic habits to take. There's nothing that's going to transform my life and make me a superhuman of sorts. It just made me a better listener, I think. It sounds a little cliche or a little trite when I say it out loud like this, but yeah. And you don't have to be told what to do or what to think in reading other people's experiences, whether they write it in the form of fiction or non-fiction. Reading from all of these different perspectives throughout the years kind of reveals a way of, okay, how am I navigating my problems now versus how did they navigate their societal, their personal problems back in the day. Reading about Sylvia Plath's experiences, about Dostoevsky when they were in some of the darkest places that they were in their life. Just sometimes you just want to do that, you know, you just want to sit there in that dark side of the human experience and just be like, yeah, well, sometimes it'd be like this, I guess. And it almost reminds me of reading the book of Ecclesiastes. It's similar to me to what Dostoevsky writes in Notes for the Underground, for example. And yeah, for me, as a person of faith, the Bible beats it all. The Bible has a lot of the things that I'm talking about the breadth and the width and the length and height of the human experiences, and all its messiness and all its goriness and all the love and all the sense of whimsy and wonder. And it's all in the Bible for me, and it's a wonderful collection right there. But that's me. And if you want to read other books, I suggest that you try to read books that are, maybe written in the English language, but probably the authors are based in other countries. Like, I probably also suggest Teju Cole's Every Day is for the Thief. It's it's such a chaotic description of the city Lagos, and it reminds me of the city I live in, Addis Ababa. It's just, it was a wild ride to read that book. And also another thing that I kind of forgot to mention is that books don't really tell you things, they kind of show you. It's the show, not don't tell thing that you learn about writing. And reading from all of these different voices also helps you to develop your own over time, or to experiment with your own. And if you're going to start writing, I really think this is a good place to start, by reading what other people have written, and by reading a diverse variety of things. It doesn't have to just be novels. Flowers for Algernon was such a wonderful book, and it was something I read in my literature book back in the day, and it's still something that makes me tear up just when I remember it. It's a science fiction short story that turned into a novel, but still, books like that don't tell you be kind or be empathizing. They show you examples of empathy, of kindness, and I think that's another cool thing about reading, from snooping on those different experiences. And I know we're stepping into very uncertain times, into a very strange territory, the future, and it really helps to know how humans have been navigating uncertainty and fear in the past. Humans, just human, single human individuals, mortal beings like you, going through all of this confusion, growing up, going through the pain of growing while they are grown up, and writing about it, sharing about it, doing that with shame and with no shame. And regarding what Wilde asked me about how to remember the things or the contents of a book you read, or whatever text it is that you learned something from, I saw a YouTube video and I can't find it now. I'm gonna find it and link it in the description when I do. It's about someone who figured out that when you learn something and you try to fit everything you learned in short written form and a tiny sketch in the corner, it's going to help you remember that much better. And when you stack up those lists of index notes, you're going to be able to just refer to them when you're free once in a while. Just have the stack in your desk, in your study, and it would make a very big difference in how you memorize things, how you catalog things. And he learned a lot about filmmaking that way. So I really suggest you do that. I haven't tried it yet though. I have the same problem Wilde had, and I gotta practice what I talk about. So I'm gonna let you know how that goes if I try it. And until next time, I hope you have a wonderful time. Be abundantly blessed, and love you guys. Take care.